The vampire king was weeping actual tears when the maid found him in the castle's highest tower. But instead of terror, she felt her heart break for his pain. Until she realized those weren't tears of sorrow, they were tears of rage, and she'd just witnessed him mourning the last of his humanity before declaring war on the mortal world. Elena's worn leather boots found each stone step with practiced quiet as she climbed the spiral staircase that servants whispered about in shadowed corners. The tower had been forbidden for as long as anyone could remember, its thick wooden door bearing rusted iron hinges that groaned like dying breath whenever the wind caught them just right. Tonight, the storm hammered against the narrow windows with such ferocity that the ancient glass rattled in its lead frames, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls where centuries of dampness had stained the stones in patterns that looked almost like tears. She clutched the bundle of forgotten linens against her chest, feeling the coarse fabric through her simple brown dress as thunder rolled overhead like the footsteps of angry gods. Her green eyes, sharp from years of noticing what others missed, swept the narrow passage ahead where flickering torchlight created pools of amber warmth against the encroaching darkness. The climb seemed endless, each step taking her further from the familiar sounds of the castle below, where other servants would be banking fires and checking locks before retreating to their quarters. Rain struck the windows with increasing violence, and Elena found herself counting the beats between lightning and thunder, a habit from childhood when storms meant huddling with her younger sister in their cottage while their mother sang lullabies to mask the sound of nature's fury. Her calloused hands, marked by years of scrubbing floors and washing linens, gripped the iron railing as she reached the final curve of the staircase, where the air grew colder and seemed to press against her skin like invisible fingers testing her resolve. The heavy oak door at the tower's peak stood slightly ajar, and through the gap came a sound that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Someone was crying with the kind of deep, soul-wrenching sobs that spoke of loss beyond human comprehension. She hesitated, her practical mind warring with an instinct she couldn't name, before pushing the door open with trembling fingers. The circular chamber beyond was lit by a single candle that cast wavering shadows across stone walls adorned with tapestries so old their colors had faded to whispers of their former glory. In the center of the room, silhouetted against a window where lightning split the sky in jagged silver lines, sat a figure that made Elena's heart stop entirely. King Lucian Dracul, the vampire king whose very name was spoken in hushed tones throughout the kingdom, knelt on the cold stone floor with his shoulders shaking and his raven-black hair falling like a dark curtain across his pale face. In his hands he cradled a silver locket that caught the candlelight and threw it back in fractured rainbows across the chamber walls. Blood-red tears tracked down his marble-white cheeks, staining his shirt where they fell, and his storm-gray eyes held a pain so profound that Elena felt it like a physical blow to her chest. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither moved. The only sounds the storm's fury and the vampire king's quiet weeping that seemed to echo from some hollow place deep within his immortal soul. When their eyes met across the candlelit chamber, Elena saw something that contradicted every whispered tale she'd heard about the monster who ruled from his dark castle. Behind the supernatural beauty and the otherworldly grace that marked him as something beyond mortal ken, she glimpsed a broken man drowning in grief so ancient it had worn grooves in his very being. His storm-gray gaze held hers with an intensity that should have sent her fleeing down the tower steps, but instead she found herself taking a careful step forward, her green eyes never leaving his face, as she searched for words that might bridge the impossible distance between servant and king, between mortal and vampire, between stranger and someone clearly suffering beyond all measure. The silver locket in his hands glinted as another flash of lightning illuminated the chamber, and Elena could see that it bore an inscription in letters too small to read from where she stood. But the way he held it spoke of something precious beyond all earthly treasure. His tears continued to fall, each drop catching the light like liquid rubies before disappearing into the shadows at his feet. And Elena realized she was witnessing something that no other living soul had ever seen. The Vampire King slowly raised his head, and Elena saw his eyes widen with something that might have been surprise or perhaps recognition of something he'd thought lost forever. She should have been terrified, should have dropped the linens and run screaming down the stairs to warn the other servants that their king had finally succumbed to the madness that all vampires eventually faced. But instead, she found herself reaching into her apron pocket with steady hands. Her fingers closed around the simple cotton handkerchief her mother had embroidered with tiny wildflowers years ago, back when Elena had been just another village girl with dreams of something greater than washing clothes by the river and tending to younger siblings. Without speaking, without breaking the spell that seemed to have fallen over the tower chamber, Elena walked forward across the cold stone floor until she stood before the Vampire King who ruled over darkness and death. And she held out the small square of fabric with its cheerful yellow flowers and careful stitching that spoke of a mother's love and a simpler world where handkerchiefs could dry any tear. Lucian stared at the offered handkerchief as if it were some alien artifact from a world he'd forgotten existed, his blood-red tears continuing to fall as he struggled to comprehend this simple gesture of kindness from a mortal who should have been cowering in terror. The silver locket trembled in his grip, and Elena could see that his hands, despite their supernatural stillness, shook with some internal earthquake that threatened to tear him apart from within. When he finally reached out to take the handkerchief, their fingers brushed for just an instant, and Elena felt a shock of cold that ran up her arm like lightning, carrying with it images and emotions that weren't her own, but blazed through her mind with startling clarity. She saw a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, saw a small child with curls that caught sunlight like spun gold, saw fire and screaming and blood that stained everything it touched. And beneath it all, she felt rage so pure and consuming that it threatened to devour everything in its path. The Vampire King's tears, she realized with dawning horror, weren't tears of sorrow at all, but something far more dangerous, something that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed that could never be uncrossed again. Lucian's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries and the hollow echo of tombs where love had been buried so long ago that only hate remained to mark its passing. He told her about the silver locket and the portraits it contained, speaking in a tone so devoid of warmth that Elena felt ice forming in her veins as she listened to words that painted pictures of loss beyond imagining. Isabella had been mortal, had been beautiful, had been everything that made existence bearable in a world where immortality stretched like an endless gray corridor with no doors and no hope of escape. She died on a night much like this one, when storms raged and lightning split the sky, killed by hunters who sought to wound the Vampire King through the only thing he'd ever loved more than his own dark existence. Their daughter Arya had been only 4 years old, had called him Papa with a voice like silver bells, had braided flowers in his hair, and made him remember what it felt like to smile. And she too had died screaming his name while he was too far away to save her, too consumed with matters of state and the endless politics of ruling a kingdom balanced on the knife's edge between the mortal world and the realm of shadows. Tonight marked 200 years since their deaths, 2 centuries of anniversaries spent in this tower chamber where their ghosts lived in every shadow and their absence filled the air like poisonous smoke that grew thicker with each passing year. The Vampire King's storm-gray eyes fixed on Elena's face as he spoke of armies gathering in the crypts beneath the castle, of creatures who'd waited centuries for his command to rise and take their revenge on the mortal world that had stolen everything worth protecting. Dawn would bring war, he told her, his voice growing colder with each word as he described plans that would turn the kingdom into a charnel house where no living thing would escape the wrath of the undead. Villages would burn, children would scream, and mothers would weep over the bodies of their families, just as he had wept over Isabella and Arya, because the cycle of pain demanded its due, and he had finally grown tired of being the only one who suffered. Elena listened to these revelations with growing horror, understanding that she had stumbled not just into the Vampire King's private grief, but into the moment when that grief transformed into something that would reshape the world in ways too terrible to contemplate. The handkerchief in his hands, so small and innocent with its embroidered flowers, seemed like a mockery against the backdrop of such consuming darkness. But still she didn't flee, couldn't abandon this broken creature even knowing that her presence here would likely mean her death, whether by his hand or by the consequences of whatever ancient magic she could feel stirring in the air around them. Thunder crashed overhead as the Vampire King's tears began to slow, his rage crystallizing into something harder and more focused than mere emotion, something that would fuel the destruction he planned to unleash with the rising sun. Elena watched his face change, saw humanity drain from his features like water from a broken vessel, and realized she was witnessing the death of whatever remained of the man he'd once been before immortality and loss had carved away everything soft and mortal and capable of mercy. The silver locket caught candlelight and threw it back in patterns that danced across the stone walls like shadows of the ghosts that haunted this chamber. And Elena understood that she stood at a crossroads, where her next words or actions would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of every living soul in the kingdom below. The simple act of offering comfort to someone in pain had somehow become something larger, something that connected her to forces she couldn't comprehend, but could feel pulling at her with the inexorable power of destiny itself. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the tower chamber an even more dangerous tempest was building, one that would either destroy everything in its path or transform it into something entirely new. And Elena Marchetti, a maid with calloused hands and observant green eyes, found herself standing at its center with nothing but faith and foolish courage to guide her through the darkness that was about to descend. The moment Elena's fingertips brushed against Lucian's pale skin as she pressed the handkerchief into his trembling hands, the air in the tower chamber suddenly crackled with an energy that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves, ancient magic stirring to life after lying dormant for centuries, like embers buried beneath ash that suddenly catch flame when touched by the right wind. A golden light, barely visible but warm against her skin, flickered between their joined hands for just an instant before fading, leaving behind a sensation that Elena couldn't quite name, but that felt like invisible threads weaving themselves around her heart and pulling tight with each breath she took. The Vampire King's storm-gray eyes widened with something that might have been recognition or perhaps terror as he stared at their intertwined fingers, his blood-red tears stopping so suddenly it was as if someone had turned off a faucet, and Elena felt a strange tingling sensation spreading up her arm from the point of contact that spoke of forces beyond mortal understanding, now binding them together in ways she couldn't comprehend. The silver locket slipped from his other hand and clattered to the stone floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the chamber, broken only by the storm's continued fury against the windows and the rapid beating of Elena's heart that somehow seemed to echo in perfect rhythm with some deeper pulse she could feel thrumming through the castle's ancient foundations. She tried to pull her hand away, but found herself unable to break the connection. Not because he was holding her, but because something deeper and more fundamental had taken root between them. Something that felt like destiny itself had reached down from whatever realm such things dwelt in and declared that their fates were now intertwined beyond any power of separation. The heavy oak door burst open with such violence that it struck the stone wall behind it and sent dust cascading from the ancient hinges, and through the doorway stepped a figure that made Elena's blood run cold, despite the warmth she still felt flowing between her hand and Lucian's. Court advisor Matthias moved with the fluid grace that marked all of his kind, his 4 centuries of existence evident in every calculated step he took across the chamber floor, his silver hair catching the candlelight and reflecting it back like polished metal, while his calculating amber eyes swept the scene before him with the kind of analytical precision that spoke of a mind accustomed to seeing patterns and connections that escaped lesser intellects. His pale lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile as he took in the sight of the vampire king kneeling on the floor with a mortal servant, their hands still joined despite the obvious shock on both their faces, and Elena could see knowledge dawning in his ancient gaze, like sunrise breaking over a landscape of terrible possibilities. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ages and the cold certainty of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, who had seen the same patterns repeat themselves across the centuries, like some cosmic joke that never grew old despite its repetition. And his words fell into the chamber like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this single moment in time. The lex compassionis, Matthias explained, with the clinical detachment of a scholar discussing some abstract philosophical concept, rather than a law that would determine whether two people lived or died, was one of the oldest statutes in the vampire code, created in the Dark Ages when the first vampire kings had begun to lose themselves so completely to rage and bloodlust that they threatened to expose their entire race to destruction by waging open war against humanity. The law stated with brutal simplicity that any mortal who showed genuine compassion to a grieving vampire king, who touched him with intent to comfort rather than harm, would become bound to his fate through magic so ancient that its origins had been forgotten by all but a handful of scholars who kept such knowledge locked away in libraries that existed in realms where mortal feet could never tread. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she listened to words that painted her simple act of kindness in shades of consequence she could never have imagined, her green eyes darting between Matthias and Lucian as she tried to process information that seemed to remake the very foundations of reality around her. She was now, according to laws written in blood and sealed with power that predated the kingdoms of men, Lucian's anchor of humanity, bound to either restore the emotional connections that made him something more than a monster, or watch them both face execution at the hands of the vampire council that governed their kind with iron discipline and showed mercy only when it served their greater purposes. 3 days, Matthias continued, with the same emotionless precision, his amber eyes fixed on Elena's face, as if studying her reaction for signs of weakness or despair that might indicate whether she possessed the inner strength necessary for the task that now lay before her. 72 hours to accomplish what had seemed impossible, even when Lucian had possessed a mortal wife and daughter who anchored him to the world of the living, to somehow reach into the hollow shell of rage and grief that he had become and kindle there the spark of love, joy, or hope that would prove his humanity still existed beneath layers of darkness that had been accumulating for 2 centuries, like snow that never melts but only grows deeper and more impenetrable with each passing winter. The magic that bound them would sustain Elena's life during this period, preventing Lucian from draining her blood either intentionally or through the simple proximity that their connection now demanded. But it would also ensure that if she failed to restore his humanity by the appointed deadline, both their souls would be forfeit to whatever realm waited beyond death for creatures who had transgressed against the natural order of things. Elena felt the weight of this knowledge settling on her shoulders like a mantle made of lead, crushing and inescapable. But beneath the fear she found something else stirring, something that might have been determination, or perhaps simple stubbornness inherited from generations of women who had faced impossible odds and somehow found ways to survive. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if responding to the drama unfolding in the tower chamber, rain lashing against the windows with such fury that the ancient glass began to leak thin streams of water that pooled on the stone floor and reflected the candlelight in wavering patterns that looked almost like writing in some language Elena couldn't read. Lucian had remained silent throughout Matthias's explanation, his storm-gray eyes fixed on their joined hands with an expression that cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been the faintest glimmer of hope before settling into the kind of resigned acceptance that spoke of someone who had long ago stopped fighting against the cruel ironies that seemed to govern his existence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of tombs and lost dreams, telling Elena that she should run now while she still could, that the magic binding them was new and weak and might still be broken if she could reach the castle gates before dawn, that no mortal should be asked to shoulder the burden of his salvation when he himself had given up believing that such a thing was possible. But even as he urged her to flee, Elena could feel the pull of their connection growing stronger with each passing moment, invisible threads weaving themselves into patterns that felt permanent and unbreakable, and she knew with certainty that bordered on prophecy that her fate was now inextricably linked to his, regardless of any choices she might make. Matthias withdrew from the chamber with the same fluid grace he had displayed upon entering, his silver hair catching the last glimmers of candlelight before disappearing into the shadows beyond the doorway. But not before delivering one final piece of information that fell like a blade between Elena and any illusions she might have harbored about the simplicity of her task. The Vampire Council, he informed them with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, was already en route to the castle, summoned by magical means that had carried news of the binding across vast distances in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They would arrive before the next sunset, bringing with them centuries of accumulated wisdom and an equal measure of ruthless pragmatism that had enabled their kind to survive in a world that would destroy them if it ever learned the full truth of their existence. Elena would face judgment from beings who had walked the earth since before her ancestors had learned to write their names, who had seen the rise and fall of empires and the birth and death of gods, who would weigh her worthiness to serve as anchor to their most powerful king with the same cold calculation they might use to decide whether to spare a mouse that had somehow wandered into their council chamber. The candle finally guttered and died, plunging the tower chamber into darkness broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning that transformed the familiar space into something alien and threatening, full of shadows that seemed to move with purpose and whispers that might have been wind or might have been voices from whatever realm the dead inhabited when they chose to visit the world of the living. Elena felt Lucian's hand grow cold in hers, his supernatural nature asserting itself now that the shock of their binding had begun to wear off. But she didn't pull away, despite the chill that spread up her arm like winter claiming ground that had known only summer warmth. Instead, she squeezed his fingers gently, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but that sent ripples through the magic connecting them, tiny waves of warmth that spoke of determination and stubborn hope in the face of odds that would have crushed lesser spirits. 3 days to accomplish the impossible, to reach into a heart that had been frozen for 2 centuries and somehow kindle there the fire of human emotion, to prove that love could triumph over rage and hope could flourish even in soil that had been salted with tears of blood and watered with the bitter rain of endless grief. Outside, the storm began to abate, its fury spent after hours of battering the ancient stones that had weathered countless such tempests and would weather countless more in the years to come. But inside the tower chamber, a different kind of tempest was just beginning, one that would test not just Elena's courage, but the very foundations of everything she had ever believed about the nature of love and redemption and the power of simple human kindness to transform even the most broken soul. The Vampire King sat in darkness beside a mortal maid, their hands still joined by magic and fate and something deeper than either, while somewhere in the distance the sound of approaching hoofbeats carried on the wind, like the drumming of destiny itself, drawing ever closer to a reckoning that would determine not just their survival, but the future of every living thing that called this kingdom home. Elena closed her eyes and felt the weight of 3 days settling around her like armor, heavy and uncomfortable but necessary for the battle that lay ahead, and in the depths of her heart, she kindled the first small flame of the fire she would need to save them both. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The door to Isabella's chambers had been sealed with wax and ribbons that crumbled at Elena's touch, releasing the scent of roses and lavender that had somehow survived too. Centuries of abandonment to greet her like whispers from another world. Dust motes danced in silver moonbeams that streamed through tall windows draped in fabric so fine it might have been woven from spider silk, and every surface bore the patina of time that spoke of a life interrupted mid-breath, as if Isabella had simply stepped out for a moment and might return at any second to continue the embroidery that still lay stretched on its wooden frame beside the window seat. Elena's bare feet made no sound on the Persian carpet that covered the floor in patterns of deep burgundy and gold, its threads still rich despite the years that had passed since anyone walked upon it. And she found herself moving through the preserved space with the reverence one might show in a cathedral where saints had once knelt in prayer. The vampire king had given her permission to explore the castle during the 3 days allotted by the ancient law, perhaps hoping she might find some clue to restore his humanity. Or perhaps simply because he no longer cared what became of anything in his domain, and Elena had been drawn to this particular door by an instinct she couldn't explain, as if something called to her from beyond the sealed threshold. The chamber revealed itself in layers as Elena lit candles from the taper she carried, each new flame bringing more details into focus, like memories surfacing from the depths of a troubled sleep. Isabella's dressing table still held bottles of perfume and pots of rouge, their contents long dried to powder but their crystal surfaces still catching and fracturing the candlelight into rainbow fragments that danced across the walls. A book lay open beside the mirror, its pages yellowed with age, but its text still legible in the flowing script of someone who had taken care with every letter. And Elena could see that it was a collection of love poems, written in languages she recognized as French and Italian, with notes in the margins written in a hand so delicate it seemed more like art than mere writing. The bed dominated one wall, its 4 posts carved with roses and vines that seemed to move in the flickering light, and upon its coverlet of silk and velvet lay a single white rose that had somehow preserved its shape despite being desiccated by centuries of solitude, its petals now transparent as parchment, but still retaining the ghost of their original beauty. But it was the writing desk in the far corner that drew Elena like a lodestone, its surface covered with papers and books, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal whose pages fluttered slightly in the draft from the windows, as if eager to share secrets that had been locked away for far too long. Elena's hands trembled as she opened the diary, feeling like an intruder in this most private of spaces, yet unable to resist the pull of curiosity that had always been both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. The first entry was dated nearly 250 years ago, when Isabella Rossetti had been a seamstress newly arrived at the castle to work in the service of the vampire king, and her words painted a picture of fear and wonder as she described her first encounters with the immortal ruler, who seemed more myth than man. She wrote of his terrible beauty and the way his presence could fill a room with shadows even in broad daylight, but also of moments when she glimpsed something vulnerable beneath his supernatural facade, moments when his storm-gray eyes would soften with what looked almost like longing for something he believed forever beyond his reach. Page after page revealed the slow transformation of terror into fascination, fascination into understanding, and understanding into a love so profound that Isabella's very handwriting seemed to glow with warmth, even after all these years of solitude and silence. Elena read of stolen moments in castle corridors, where Isabella would catch glimpses of the vampire king reading poetry or tending to injured animals with a gentleness that contradicted everything the world believed about his nature, and she began to understand that Isabella had seen past the monster to the man, just as Elena herself had done in the tower chamber, where blood-red tears had revealed more truth than centuries of legend and rumor. The diary entries grew more passionate as Isabella described falling in love with someone the world deemed incapable of such mortal emotions, writing of conversations that lasted until dawn, where Lucian would speak of his mortal life before the transformation that had cursed him to eternal existence, of his struggles to maintain some connection to the humanity he'd lost, when fangs replaced his natural teeth and his heart learned to beat only when strong emotions stirred it to temporary life. Isabella wrote of begging him to turn her into a vampire so they might share eternity together. And Elena felt her own heart break as she read Lucian's refusal, his insistence that he would not damn the woman he loved to the same cursed existence that had already stolen his soul piece by piece across the centuries. The pages revealed a man tortured by love for someone whose mortality made her both precious and fragile beyond measure, someone whose very heartbeat reminded him of everything he'd lost and could never reclaim, yet whose presence made his empty existence bearable for the first time since his transformation from man to monster. Elena discovered that she and Isabella shared more than just their humble origins as servants in the vampire king's household. They shared the ability to see past supernatural beauty and immortal power to the wounded soul that dwelt beneath, the capacity to love someone whom the world had written off as irredeemably lost to darkness and death. As Elena turned the pages, following Isabella's journey from servant to beloved, she became aware of a presence in the doorway behind her, a familiar chill that made the candle flames dance without any breeze to disturb them. She didn't turn around, didn't need to see the vampire king's face to know that he stood watching her read the private thoughts of the woman who had been everything to him before death stole her away. But she could feel his eyes upon her like winter wind against her skin, could sense the war between pain and something that might have been relief playing out in the silence that stretched between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. When Lucian finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of tombs and the weight of memories that had grown heavier with each passing year. And he told Elena of the night Isabella died with the same careful precision one might use to describe a surgical procedure, as if emotional distance might somehow lessen the impact of words that had the power to shatter what remained of his immortal heart. The vampire hunters had come during a winter storm much like the one that raged the night Elena found him weeping, and they had taken Isabella not to kill her immediately, but to use her as bait in a trap designed to destroy the vampire king through the only weakness they'd been able to discover in his otherwise impenetrable defenses. The hunters had demanded that Lucian surrender himself and submit to execution in exchange for Isabella's life, not knowing that she carried his child in her womb, not understanding that their bargain involved not one life, but two precious souls, whose destruction would complete the vampire king's transformation from wounded immortal to something far darker and more dangerous than anything they could imagine. Isabella had broken free of her captors during the exchange, had thrown herself between the hunters and 4-year-old Arya when they realized their trap had failed and decided to take their revenge through the innocents who bore the vampire king's love. And she had died with his daughter's name on her lips, while Lucian fought through a dozen armed men to reach them both too late to do anything but hold their broken bodies as life fled from their eyes like birds escaping an open cage. Elena listened to this recounting, with tears streaming down her cheeks, understanding now why the vampire king's grief had transformed into rage so pure it could fuel war against an entire world, why his tears in the tower had been red with fury rather than clear with simple sorrow, and why his plans for vengeance encompassed not just the hunters who had killed his family, but every mortal soul whose continued existence seemed like mockery of his loss. But it was when Lucian spoke of Arya that Elena felt her heart break entirely, heard him describe his daughter with a voice that cracked like ice under pressure, revealing fissures where love still lived despite the hatred that had grown up around it, like thorns choking a rose garden. He told Elena of Arya's laughter echoing through castle corridors that had known only shadows for centuries before her birth, of the way she would chase butterflies in the courtyard gardens while he watched from windows high above, afraid that his very presence might somehow taint her innocence, yet unable to resist the joy of seeing her discover the world, with wonder that reminded him why existence might be worthwhile after all. The Vampire King spoke of teaching Arya to read, using books of fairy tales, where princesses married their true loves and everyone lived happily ever after, stories he'd once dismissed as mortal foolishness, but had come to treasure for the hope they kindled in his daughter's bright eyes. And Elena could hear in his voice the echo of the man he'd been before grief carved away everything soft and vulnerable and capable of believing in happy endings. When he described the last memory he had of Arya alive, his voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the grave. And Elena saw in her mind's eye a little girl with Isabella's warm smile and Lucian's dark hair placing wildflowers in her father's hair while he knelt in the garden, calling him Papa with a voice like silver bells, and making him laugh for what would be the last time in his immortal existence. Elena remained silent as the Vampire King finished his recounting, understanding that she had been granted access to memories so precious and painful that speaking them aloud was like opening old wounds that had never properly healed, and she felt the weight of his trust settle upon her shoulders, like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. The diary in her hands seemed heavier now, its pages filled not just with Isabella's words, but with the ghost of a love story that had ended in tragedy so complete it had rewritten the very nature of the man who survived it, transforming protector into destroyer, lover into avenger, father into the architect of apocalypse. She understood now why the ancient law had bound her to the Vampire King's fate, why her simple act of compassion in the tower had triggered magic older than kingdoms and more powerful than any spell woven by mortal hands, because healing the kind of damage that had been done to Lucian's soul would require more than time or distance or even forgiveness. It would require someone willing to step into the ruins of his heart and help him remember why love was worth the risk of loss, why protecting innocence mattered even when protection had failed before, why the laughter of children was worth preserving, even when the memory of such laughter brought nothing but pain. The magical mirror that stood in the corner of Isabella's chamber began to glow with soft silver light as Lucian approached it, his reflection wavering like water disturbed by stones, and Elena realized she was about to witness something that no living person had ever seen: memories preserved in enchanted glass that could show the past as clearly as any window showed the present. The surface rippled and cleared to reveal a garden bathed in sunlight, where flowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and a small girl with dark curls and bright eyes chased butterflies between rose bushes, while her father watched from a marble bench, his face transformed by an expression of wonder and joy that made him look more mortal than any human Elena had ever known. She watched Arya dance through the memories, saw her learn to write her name in careful letters, while Lucian guided her small hand with infinite patience, witnessed the bedtime stories and lullabies sung in ancient Romanian that spoke of brave knights and beautiful princesses, and love that conquered even death itself. But it was the final memory that shattered Elena's heart completely: the image of 4-year-old Arya crowning her Vampire King father with a circlet of daisies and dandelions while he knelt in the grass, her small hands gentle as she arranged each stem with the seriousness of someone performing a sacred ritual, calling him Papa, with such pure love that his laughter rang out across the garden like church bells celebrating some miracle too precious for words. Elena understood then that Lucian's war against humanity was really a war against his own guilt, a desperate attempt to make the world pay for his failure to protect the innocent child who had loved him unconditionally, who had seen only her papa where others saw a monster, who had died calling his name while he arrived moments too late to save the light that had made his immortal existence bearable for the brief span of her mortal life. Elena woke on the second morning of her 3 days with determination burning in her chest, like a small flame that refused to be extinguished by the weight of impossibility pressing down upon her from all sides. The castle around her seemed to pulse with darkness that had settled into its very stones over centuries of hosting a king whose heart had frozen into something harder than winter itself. But as she moved through corridors hung with tapestries depicting battles and death, Elena began to wage her own quiet war against the shadows that had claimed dominion over this place. She started with the smallest acts of rebellion, pulling heavy curtains away from tall windows to let moonlight stream across floors that hadn't seen such illumination in decades. And though the silver beams were pale and cold compared to sunlight, they still possessed the power to transform dust motes into dancing spirits and reveal beauty that had been hidden in artificial twilight for far too long. The servants she encountered on her rounds watched her with expressions that cycled between confusion and something that might have been hope, as if they too had forgotten that light belonged in the world of the living and were surprised to discover they'd missed it during all those years of accepting darkness as the natural state of things. In the courtyard she discovered gardens that had once bloomed with Isabella's favorite flowers, but now grew wild and untended. Their beauty turned savage by neglect, yet still possessing an undeniable vitality that spoke of roots too deep to be killed by simple abandonment. Elena gathered armfuls of the wildflowers that had sprouted between carefully planned beds, their petals bright against her brown dress as she carried them through the castle like small torches of color in a world that had forgotten the existence of anything beyond shades of gray and black. She arranged them in vases throughout the throne room where the vampire king held court with his advisors, their fragrance mixing with the scent of old stone and forgotten dreams to create something new and unexpected. Something that made even Matthias pause in his recitation of daily reports to inhale deeply before continuing with his usual clinical precision. When Lucian entered and saw the flowers scattered across surfaces that hadn't been decorated with anything living in 2 centuries, his storm-gray eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or perhaps surprise. But he said nothing, merely took his place on the throne carved from black marble and tried to pretend that roses and daisies weren't filling the air around him with memories of a time when beauty had been welcome in his domain. As Elena moved through her days, she found herself humming melodies that seemed to rise from some deep well within her memory, lullabies her own mother had sung, and songs she'd heard drifting through castle windows during festivals when the village below had celebrated life instead of mourning death. The tunes were simple and sweet, carrying words in languages she didn't recognize, but whose meanings felt familiar in the way that love and comfort always felt familiar, regardless of the tongue that shaped them. And she realized with a start that some of these melodies matched the ones she'd witnessed in the magical mirror when Lucian sang his daughter to sleep, in memories that glowed with happiness too pure to be dimmed by the centuries that had passed since they were made. The vampire king appeared in doorways and corridors when he thought she couldn't see him, drawn by music that seemed to slip through the cracks in his armor like water finding its way through stone, and Elena caught glimpses of his face transforming as he listened to songs that carried him back to evenings when putting Arya to bed had been the highlight of his existence, rather than just another reminder of everything he'd lost. The wounded sparrow fell from its nest during a storm that rattled the castle's ancient windows and sent rain drumming against stone like the fingers of ghosts trying to find their way inside. Elena discovered the tiny creature on the stones of the courtyard where it lay, with one wing twisted at an angle that spoke of pain and vulnerability, its bright eyes reflecting moonlight as it struggled to fly, despite the injury that kept it earthbound and helpless. Without hesitation, she gathered the sparrow in her gentle hands, feeling its rapid heartbeat against her palms like a prayer for mercy, offered by something too small and innocent to understand why the world could be so cruel to creatures whose only crime was existing in the wrong place when accident chose to strike. She fashioned a nest from soft cloth in her chamber and spent hours coaxing the frightened bird to accept water and crumbs of bread, speaking to it in the same soft voice she might use with a frightened child. And slowly the sparrow began to trust this strange giant who offered kindness instead of the predatory hunger it had learned to expect from being so much larger than itself. Lucian found her there 3 days into her vigil with the injured bird, standing in the doorway of her chamber like a shadow given substance, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the sight of Elena's calloused hands, stroking feathers that gleamed like polished obsidian in the candlelight. For long moments neither spoke, the only sounds the soft chirping of the sparrow and Elena's whispered reassurances that tomorrow would bring healing if the small creature could just find the courage to keep fighting for one more day. She felt the Vampire King's presence like winter wind against her skin, but didn't turn to acknowledge him, sensing somehow that any sudden movement might break whatever spell was allowing him to witness this scene of tenderness, without retreating into the armor of rage that had protected his heart from feeling anything for so long. When she finally did glance toward the doorway, she caught a glimpse of his face, transformed by an expression she couldn't quite name, something that spoke of recognition and longing, and the kind of pain that comes from remembering joy that once existed but seems impossible to reclaim. The sparrow recovered over the following days under Elena's patient care, its wing healing with the resilience that marked wild things accustomed to surviving against odds that would crush more delicate creatures. And when it finally took flight from her open palm to disappear into the night sky beyond her chamber window, Elena felt something shift in the atmosphere of the castle itself. The Vampire King had taken to appearing more frequently during her ministrations to the small creature, never speaking, but always watching with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to catalog every gesture of compassion, as if he were a scholar studying some phenomenon he'd heard described, but never witnessed firsthand. She began to understand that her care for something so fragile and mortal was awakening in him memories of why he had once devoted his immortal strength to protecting rather than destroying, why he had chosen to use his supernatural powers as a shield for the innocent rather than a weapon against the world that had shaped him into something both more and less than human. The library had become Elena's refuge during the evening hours when her duties in other parts of the castle were complete and she found herself with time to think about the impossible task that lay before her. The vast chamber lined with books from floor to ceiling held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, volumes written in languages both living and dead that contained everything from poetry to philosophy to the kind of practical knowledge that helped civilizations rise from barbarism to something approaching grace. It was here, surrounded by the thoughts and dreams of countless mortal minds preserved in leather and parchment, that Elena felt most connected to the humanity she was supposed to help Lucian reclaim. And it was here that she found him on the second night of her 3-day deadline, sitting in a chair before the fireplace where flames cast dancing shadows across walls lined with the collected knowledge of ages. In his hands, he held a small book bound in red leather, worn smooth by countless readings, its pages yellowed with age, but still containing the kind of simple illustrations that were meant to capture the imagination of young minds not yet burdened by the weight of understanding how cruel the world could be to those who dared to hope for happy endings. Elena recognized it immediately from the memories she'd witnessed in Isabella's mirror, saw in her mind's eye a little girl with dark curls and bright eyes, listening with rapt attention as her father read stories of brave princesses and noble knights, and love that conquered even death itself. The Vampire King's fingers traced the illustrations with a tenderness that spoke of practice, of countless evenings when this ritual had been the cornerstone of his existence, the moment each day when immortal power and supernatural beauty mattered less than simply being Papa to someone who loved him without reservation or fear. Thunder rolled across the sky beyond the library windows as Elena approached the chair where Lucien sat frozen in memory. And when lightning illuminated his face, she saw not the Vampire King who ruled through fear and commanded armies of the undead, but a father lost in grief, so profound it had rewritten the very foundations of his immortal soul. Without asking permission or waiting for invitation, Elena settled herself in the chair beside his, close enough to see the words on the pages he held, but careful not to touch him, lest she break whatever fragile spell allowed him to lower his guard enough to revisit these most precious and painful of memories. The book contained the story of a lonely king who ruled over a kingdom shrouded in eternal winter, whose heart had been frozen by tragedy until a simple act of kindness from an unlikely source taught him to love again and brought spring back to lands that had forgotten the meaning of warmth and growth and the kind of hope that made flowers bloom even in the darkest soil. Elena's voice wavered with emotion as she began to read the familiar tale aloud, her words carrying across the library like music that had the power to transform even the most wounded heart, and she felt, rather than saw, Lucian's attention shift from the pages in his hands to the sound of her voice, speaking words that Isabella had once shared with their daughter in this very room. The story unfolded with the simple beauty that marked the best fairy tales, its message clear, despite the childlike language that wrapped profound truths in images young minds could grasp. And Elena found herself thinking of all the evenings when this book had been a bridge between immortal father and mortal daughter, a shared ritual that made family out of beings who should have been separated by the impossible gulf between the living and the undead. As she read of the lonely king's journey from despair to redemption, she could feel something shifting in the air around them, some fundamental change in the quality of silence that suggested walls built over centuries were beginning to develop cracks that might eventually become doorways. When she reached the story's climax, where love proved stronger than winter and hope melted even the most frozen heart, Elena's voice broke with the weight of emotion she couldn't contain, and she felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she spoke words meant for children, but containing wisdom deep enough to guide souls through the darkest passages of existence. The vampire king sat motionless beside her, his breathing so still she might have thought him dead if she hadn't been able to feel the supernatural energy that radiated from his immortal form like heat from banked coals. And when she finally reached the story's end, where spring returned to the lonely king's domain, and his people learned to smile again, Elena closed the book with trembling fingers and turned to look at the man who had once read these same words to a daughter who believed in happy endings, because her father's voice made them seem not just possible, but inevitable. A single tear fell from Lucian's storm-gray eye, catching the firelight as it traced a path down his marble-pale cheek. But this tear was different from the blood-red drops Elena had witnessed in the tower chamber during their first encounter. This tear was clear as crystal, transparent as water, carrying within it not the rage that had sustained him through 2 centuries of planning vengeance, but something else entirely. Something that spoke of cracks forming in armor that had seemed impenetrable, of ice beginning to thaw after the longest winter in recorded history. Elena watched that tear fall with the fascination of someone witnessing a miracle, understanding that she had just seen the first sign that the vampire king's humanity still existed beneath layers of grief and fury, that the man who had once been capable of reading bedtime stories with infinite patience and singing lullabies in ancient Romanian might yet be redeemed from the monster that circumstances and loss had forced him to become. The first crack in his armor of rage had appeared, small and fragile as a hairline fracture in seemingly solid stone, but visible to those who knew how to look for signs that even the most damaged heart might still remember how to beat in rhythm with hope rather than hatred. The thunderous crash of the castle's great doors splintering under the force of iron-tipped battering rams echoed through the ancient halls like the death knell of some enormous bell, sending vibrations through stone walls that had stood firm against countless sieges, but had never faced enemies who understood exactly where to strike to cause the most devastating damage. Elena had been in the library with Lucian, reading passages from Isabella's diary aloud, in the hope that hearing his beloved's words might kindle some spark of the man he'd once been, when the sound of splintering wood and shouting voices reached them through windows that suddenly blazed with the orange light of torches carried by dozens of figures moving with military precision across the castle courtyard. the vampire king's storm-gray eyes immediately hardened into something that looked like chips of winter ice, as ancient instincts honed by centuries of survival took control of his immortal form. But Elena could see something else flickering beneath the surface. Something that might have been fear, not for himself, but for her. The mortal woman, whose fate had become inextricably bound to his own, through laws older than memory, and more binding than chains forged from the strongest steel. She watched as he rose from the chair, where he'd been listening to her read, his supernatural grace transforming from the careful movements of someone trying to remember how to be gentle into the fluid precision of a predator preparing for battle. And she knew with the certainty of prophecy that the 3 days the Vampire Council had granted them were about to be cut short by forces that had no intention of allowing the ancient law to run its course. Captain Marcus Kellner strode through the shattered remains of the castle's entrance, with the confident bearing of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, his pale blue eyes scanning the great hall's vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows, with the calculating gaze of a military strategist who had studied every stone and shadow of his target, until he could navigate its corridors blindfolded. The tall windows depicted scenes of ancient battles between mortals and creatures of darkness, their colored glass casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor that seemed almost festive despite the grim purpose that had brought armed men into the vampire king's domain. And Elena noticed with a chill that ran down her spine like icy fingers that many of the scenes showed triumphant hunters standing over the bodies of defeated vampires, as if the windows themselves had been designed to mock any immortal who dared to call this place home. Behind Kellner came 24 men armed with crossbows, loaded with silver-tipped bolts and swords, whose blades gleamed with the telltale sheen of metal that had been blessed by priests and sharpened with prayers that turned ordinary steel into weapons capable of destroying creatures who had walked the earth since before Christ drew breath in a stable in Bethlehem. The captain's weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who had seen too much violence and dealt out even more, but his eyes held the cold fire of absolute conviction, the unwavering certainty of someone who believed that God himself had chosen him to cleanse the world of monsters, regardless of what forms those monsters might take, or what remnants of humanity they might still possess. Elena felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins as she recognized the family resemblance between Captain Kellner and the description Isabella had written of the hunter who had killed her and little Arya 2 centuries ago, understanding with sickening clarity that this was no random attack but a carefully planned assault by descendants who had inherited both their ancestors' mission and his intimate knowledge of exactly how to inflict the most damage on the Vampire King's carefully guarded heart. The hunters had come not primarily to kill Lucian, though they would certainly attempt that if the opportunity arose, but to destroy Elena and thereby ensure that the ancient law could never restore his humanity, that he would remain forever locked in the rage and hatred that made him a perfect monster rather than the conflicted creature he was slowly becoming under her influence. She could see the tactical brilliance of their plan reflected in Kellner's satisfied smile as his men spread out through the great hall with the precision of soldiers who had drilled this assault countless times, blocking every exit while leaving the captain himself a clear path to the central dais where a throne carved from black marble had overseen centuries of dark rule. The hunters knew about the Lex Compassionis, had somehow learned of the binding that connected Elena's fate to the Vampire King's, and they had come to sever that connection with silver blades and holy water before it could complete the transformation that would rob them of their greatest enemy by turning him back into something capable of mercy and restraint. The battle that erupted in the Great Hall was like nothing Elena had ever witnessed or imagined possible. A whirlwind of supernatural speed and mortal determination that sent ancient tapestries fluttering like battle flags and shattered priceless artifacts that had survived wars and plagues and the rise and fall of human kingdoms. Lucian moved through his attackers with the deadly grace of a wolf among sheep, his centuries of combat experience evident in every perfectly timed strike and elegant evasion, But Elena could see that he was holding back, that the humanity she had been working to restore was making him hesitate at crucial moments when the old Lucian would have simply torn out throats and painted the walls with blood. The hunters pressed their advantage with the disciplined coordination of men who had trained for this confrontation their entire lives, using silver nets and blessed chains to limit his mobility, while crossbow bolts whistled through the air with deadly precision, each one aimed not necessarily to kill, but to wound and weaken until their supernatural prey could be brought down like some magnificent but dangerous wild animal. Elena tried to stay out of the way, pressing herself against the wall near the great fireplace where portraits of long-dead nobility watched the battle with painted eyes that seemed to judge the living and find them wanting. But she knew that her safety was temporary at best, that Captain Kellner's ultimate goal was to capture her and use her as leverage against the vampire king, whose growing humanity made him vulnerable in ways his monstrous incarnation had never been. The moment Elena had dreaded arrived, when a crossbow bolt struck Lucian in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a marble pillar that cracked under the impact of his immortal form. And in that instant of vulnerability, Captain Kellner moved with the speed of someone who had spent decades waiting for exactly such an opportunity. Elena felt strong hands seize her arms before she could even think to run, felt the cold kiss of blessed steel against her throat as Kellner's lieutenant pressed a silver blade against the pulse point where her life beat its steady rhythm, and she found herself being dragged into the center of the great hall where broken glass and scattered debris marked the path of supernatural combat. The vampire king struggled to his feet, dark blood staining his white shirt where the silver bolt had torn through immortal flesh, his storm-gray eyes blazing with fury that seemed to set the very air around him ablaze. But Elena could see the terrible calculation taking place behind his gaze as he weighed his options and found them all lacking. Captain Kellner stood before his prisoner with the satisfaction of someone who had finally cornered a dangerous animal after a lifetime of pursuit. His pale blue eyes fixed on Lucian's face with the intensity of a scholar studying some fascinating but deadly specimen. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of inherited hatred and the cold certainty of someone who believed himself to be the instrument of divine justice. The choice Kellner offered was elegantly simple in its cruelty. A perfect trap designed to exploit the very humanity that Elena had been working so hard to restore in the vampire king's damaged soul. Lucian could embrace the monster he had been for 2 centuries, could unleash the full fury of his supernatural nature and slaughter every hunter in the hall. But doing so would destroy the progress Elena had made in restoring his capacity for love and mercy, would prove to the Vampire Council that he was irredeemably lost to rage and thereby ensure both their deaths when the ancient law's deadline expired. Alternatively, he could choose to protect Elena by surrendering to the hunters and accepting execution, but this too would trigger the binding that connected their fates and ensure her death along with his own, making her sacrifice meaningless except as a demonstration that he had retained enough humanity to value her life above his own continued existence. The third option, the one that Kellner clearly expected and hoped for, was that Lucian would try to save Elena through controlled use of his supernatural abilities, fighting with restraint and mercy that would prove his humanity had been restored while simultaneously making him vulnerable to weapons and tactics that could only succeed against someone who chose not to become a perfect killing machine. Elena understood the trap's diabolical perfection as she stood with silver steel against her throat, realized that the hunters had crafted a scenario where every choice led to death, except the one that required Lucian to become exactly the kind of man Isabella had loved, the kind of father Arya had adored, the kind of protector who would rather die than become a monster even to save his own life. Elena locked eyes with Lucian across the debris-strewn floor of the great hall, seeing in his storm-gray gaze the war between centuries of accumulated rage and the fragile humanity she had been nurturing through shared memories and gentle touches, and the simple act of believing he could be more than the monster the world expected him to be. Blood continued to seep from the wound in his shoulder, where silver burned like acid against immortal flesh, but she could see him gathering himself for action despite the pain, could watch the calculation taking place behind his eyes as he weighed the odds and planned moves and countermoves with the tactical precision of someone who had survived countless battles through careful preparation and perfect timing. When Elena mouthed the words that Isabella had written in her diary, the declaration of faith that had sustained their love even when the world conspired to destroy it, she saw something shift in Lucian's expression, saw storm-gray eyes flicker with warmth that reminded her of summer rain and growing things, and the possibility that even the most damaged soul could be healed through love freely given. The words she spoke without sound carried across the space between them, with the power of magic, older than the ancient law that bound their fates. A magic that existed wherever one person chose to believe in another's capacity for good, despite all evidence to the contrary. And Elena knew that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine not just whether they lived or died, but whether love truly could triumph over the darkest hatred. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Great Hall had witnessed in its centuries of existence. A dance of supernatural grace and mortal determination played out among the shattered remains of priceless artifacts, and beneath the watchful eyes of painted ancestors who had never imagined their peaceful portraits would oversee such a test of the human spirit. Lucian moved through the attacking hunters with fluid precision that spoke of perfect control rather than unleashed fury, disarming opponents without killing them, using just enough force to neutralize threats while carefully avoiding the kind of excessive violence that would have solved his tactical problems but destroyed his soul in the process. Elena watched him fight, not as a monster seeking to destroy his enemies, but as a protector working to minimize casualties, even among those who sought his destruction. And she saw in every restrained blow and carefully measured strike the echo of the man who had once sung lullabies to a little girl with flowers in her hair. When Captain Kellner himself finally stepped forward to face the Vampire King in single combat, releasing Elena to draw his own blessed sword, with hands that trembled slightly despite his decades of training and preparation, the great hall fell silent except for the whisper of steel through air and the sound of two hearts beating, one mortal and rapid with fear and determination, the other immortal and slow with the rhythm of someone who had learned to value life precisely because he had lived so long that its preciousness had become undeniable. The moment when everything changed arrived like sunrise, breaking over a landscape that had known only darkness, sudden and transformative, and impossible to mistake for anything other than the miracle it truly was. Captain Kellner lunged forward with his blessed blade aimed at the Vampire King's heart, putting all his strength and hatred behind a strike that should have ended the confrontation in a spray of blood and the satisfaction of a quest finally completed. But Lucian moved aside with supernatural grace and caught the captain's wrist in a grip that could have crushed bone, but instead simply held fast, while storm-gray eyes looked directly into pale blue ones with an expression of infinite sadness rather than rage. Elena saw the exact moment when Kellner realized he was going to die, saw him prepare for the violent end that his family's legacy had always promised. But instead of claws tearing out his throat or fangs sinking into his neck, he found himself disarmed with clinical precision and released unharmed, standing face to face with a creature he had been taught to see as irredeemably evil, but who had just demonstrated a capacity for mercy that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of monsters and men. The transformation in Lucian's eyes was visible to everyone present, storm-gray fury melting away like winter snow in spring sunshine, to reveal warm brown irises that spoke of humanity restored and love rediscovered. And Elena felt the ancient magic that bound their fates, singing in harmony with a deeper magic that existed wherever forgiveness conquered hatred, and compassion triumphed over the desire for revenge. The return of Lucian's humanity came not as a gentle dawn breaking over sleeping lands, but as a tsunami of emotion that crashed through the walls he had built around his heart with such devastating force that Elena feared it might destroy what remained of his immortal soul. In his private chambers, surrounded by shadows that seemed to press against the windows like living things eager to reclaim the darkness that had ruled this space for 2 centuries, the vampire king collapsed beneath the weight of feelings he had suppressed for so long. They had crystallized into something harder than diamond and more brittle than winter ice. Every emotion he had buried came flooding back in waves that left him gasping and shaking as if his supernatural body was rejecting the very concept of vulnerability. And Elena watched in horror as he relived not just the deaths of Isabella and Arya, but every innocent life he had taken during his reign of calculated vengeance against a world he had blamed for his losses. The process was excruciating to witness, like watching someone drown in an ocean made of their own tears. And Elena found herself holding vigil beside his bed where he writhed in agony that no physical torture could match. His storm-gray eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from confronting truths, too terrible to be borne by any conscience not already dead to feeling. She watched him remember faces he had forgotten, voices that had pleaded for mercy before being silenced forever. Families torn apart by his rage just as his own family had been destroyed by hatred and fear, and the symmetry of it seemed to tear something fundamental in his immortal essence. Children who had called for their mothers as his armies swept through villages, lovers separated by death that came too soon and too violently, innocents who had done nothing more than exist in the wrong place when the vampire king's fury finally demanded its tribute from the world. All of them returned to haunt him with the clarity that only genuine remorse could provide. Elena held his hand through each wave of memory and guilt, feeling his supernatural strength drain away as he experienced 200 years of suppressed grief compressed into the span of a single night. And she marveled at how the return of his humanity was both salvation and damnation wrapped together in a package too complex for any mortal mind to fully comprehend. His tears flowed like rivers breaking through dams that had held back their waters for so long the pressure had become unbearable, and each drop carried within it the salt of genuine sorrow, rather than the metallic taste of rage that had marked his weeping in the tower chamber, where their fates had first become intertwined. When dawn approached, and Lucian begged her through cracked lips to let him die, rather than continue bearing the weight of emotions that felt like molten lead, poured directly into his resurrected heart, Elena refused with a firmness that surprised even herself. She understood now that redemption was not a gift given freely, but a burden that had to be carried willingly by those who sought to reclaim their humanity from the darkness that had claimed it. And though her own heart broke to see him suffer, she knew that this agony was the price of becoming fully alive again after centuries of existing as something less than complete. She spoke to him of Isabella and Arya, reminding him that they had loved him not despite his capacity for tenderness, but because of it, that their memory deserved to be honored not with vengeance, but with the kind of compassion that had first drawn them to him when he was capable of seeing mortal life as something precious rather than expendable. Her voice became his anchor in the storm of returning feeling, and she held his hand with the same gentle firmness she had used when nursing the wounded sparrow back to health, understanding that souls, like birds with broken wings, required both patience and faith to learn how to fly again. The transformation reached its crescendo as the sun climbed higher in the sky beyond windows that had been thrown open to let light into chambers that had known only artificial twilight for decades. And Elena watched something fundamental shift in the vampire king's storm-gray eyes as he finally accepted the full weight of his immortal existence without the protective armor of rage to shield him from its implications. He wept tears that sparkled like crystal in the morning light, clear and pure as mountain streams, carrying within them not the bitter taste of fury, but the sweet salt of love rediscovered, and grief acknowledged, and hope tentatively offered to a future that might yet hold redemption for even the most fallen of souls. Elena felt the magical bond between them shimmer and strengthen as his humanity fully returned, their fates now intertwined not just by ancient law, but by choice and understanding, and the kind of connection that could survive even death itself. When he finally slept, his face peaceful for the first time in 2 centuries, Elena remained at his bedside like a guardian angel, watching over a miracle that had taken place one tear at a time, one memory at a time, one moment of courage at a time. The Vampire Council arrived with the setting sun, their black carriages rolling through the castle gates like funeral processions come to carry away the dead, or perhaps to create new corpses if the trial's outcome failed to meet their exacting standards. Countess Valeriana led the procession with the kind of regal bearing that spoke of centuries spent accumulating power and the ruthless intelligence needed to wield it effectively against any who threatened the careful balance her kind had maintained with the mortal world. Her silver hair was arranged in elaborate coiffures that added inches to her already imposing height, and her pale, blue eyes held the calculating coldness of winter storms that destroyed everything in their path without malice, but also without mercy. Behind her came the other members of the council, vampires so ancient that they remembered the world when it was young, and empires rose and fell like waves against shores that had seen the birth and death of gods, their very presence filling the air with power that made Elena's skin crawl and her heart race with instinctive fear of predators so far beyond human understanding that they might as well have been forces of nature, given consciousness and purpose. The trial took place in the castle's ancient crypts, where the bones of Lucian's ancestors lay in stone tombs, carved with symbols that predated written language and spoke of powers that existed before mortals learned to worship gods who might actually answer their prayers. Torchlight flickered against walls that had been hewn from living rock by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, creating shadows that seemed to move with purpose, as if the very stones remembered the weight of judgments passed in this sacred space where life and death decisions had been made since the beginning of vampire history. Elena stood beside Lucian as he faced the council's scrutiny, feeling the ancient magic that permeated this place pressing against her skin like invisible hands testing her worthiness to witness events that would determine the fate of immortal beings whose actions could reshape the balance between light and darkness throughout the known world. The Vampire King had regained his composure since the morning's emotional storm, but Elena could see that his newfound humanity sat upon his shoulders like a mantle he was still learning to wear, heavy with responsibility and bright with possibility in equal measure. Countess Valeriana began the proceedings with the formal recitation of charges that had accumulated against Lucian over the past 2 centuries, her voice carrying through the crypt with the kind of authority that brooked no argument or interruption, as she listed atrocities committed in the name of vengeance and power struggles that had threatened to expose their entire race to destruction by mortal authorities who grew more sophisticated and dangerous with each passing decade. She spoke of villages burned and families destroyed, of the delicate treaties with mortal rulers that had been strained nearly to breaking by his actions, of the fear that his instability inspired even among vampires who had learned to live with darkness as their constant companion. When she finished her recitation, the silence that followed seemed to press against the ancient stones like a physical weight, and Elena felt the crushing responsibility of knowing that her testimony might be the only thing standing between the Vampire King and a death sentence that would be carried out with the same cold efficiency the council applied to all their decisions. The Countess then began her most insidious attack, describing in excruciating detail the deaths of Isabella and Arya, with the clinical precision of someone who had studied every moment of that terrible night and understood exactly which words would inflict the maximum psychological damage on someone whose heart had only recently learned to feel pain again. She spoke of how the hunters had tortured Isabella before killing her, of the child's screams echoing through the forest as she watched her mother die, of the way Arya had continued calling for her papa even as the life drained from her small body, and Elena watched Lucian's face transform as each word struck him like a physical blow, designed to shatter the fragile peace he had found in accepting his guilt and grief. The Countess was testing him, Elena realized, trying to provoke him back into the rage that had sustained him for 2 centuries, seeking proof that his transformation was merely temporary, and that the monster still lurked beneath the surface of his reclaimed humanity, waiting for the right trigger to emerge once more and justify the execution she clearly favored as the simplest solution to the problem he represented. But Lucian's response surprised even Elena with its depth and genuinely controlled emotion, his voice carrying the weight of genuine sorrow rather than the hollow echo of rage as he acknowledged every word the Countess spoke and accepted responsibility not just for his own actions, but for his failure to protect the innocents who had suffered because of his inability to transcend the grief that had consumed him for so long. He spoke of Isabella and Arya with the kind of love that could only come from a heart that had learned to feel again, describing how their memory would now guide him toward protecting rather than destroying the kind of innocent life they had represented. How their deaths would serve not as justification for vengeance, but as inspiration for the kind of mercy and compassion they would have wanted him to show to others who faced the same vulnerabilities that had made them targets for those who sought to wound him through the things he loved most. Elena felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to words that transformed tragedy into purpose and loss into a foundation for redemption that might yet restore balance to a world that had suffered too long under the weight of his misdirected fury. When Elena was called upon to testify about the changes she had witnessed, her voice carried the ring of absolute truth as she described the transformation she had seen unfold over their brief time together, the way genuine emotion had returned to eyes that had held nothing but emptiness and rage for centuries. The tears that had changed from red to clear as his capacity for love overcame his need for vengeance. The gentle way he had watched her tend to wounded creatures, as if remembering why he had once chosen to use his power as a shield for the innocent rather than a weapon against the world. She spoke of the man she had discovered beneath the monster's reputation, of the father who still lived in the vampire king's immortal heart, despite 2 centuries of trying to bury that part of himself beneath layers of protective fury, of the husband who had loved so completely that losing his family had nearly destroyed his capacity to love anything ever again. Her words painted a picture of redemption earned through suffering, willingly accepted rather than avoided, of humanity reclaimed, not through forgetting the past, but by allowing it to guide him toward a future where his immortal existence might serve purposes higher than his own pain. The council deliberated in whispers that carried through the crypt like wind through autumn leaves, their ancient voices debating points of law and precedent that had been established when the world was young and vampires first learned to hide among mortals who would destroy them if the truth of their existence ever came to light. Elena held her breath as she watched their faces, seeing centuries of accumulated wisdom and cynicism warring with the evidence of genuine transformation that even their suspicious natures could not entirely dismiss, and she understood that they were weighing not just Lucien's fate, but the future of vampire-mortal relations that could be forever altered by their decision in this sacred place where judgment had been passed since the beginning of their immortal history. When Countess Valeriana finally spoke their verdict, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority tempered by something that might have been reluctant respect for what had been accomplished against odds that would have defeated lesser souls, and Elena felt the magical bond between herself and Lucian pulse with renewed strength as the ancient law was declared fulfilled and their lives spared to write new chapters in a story that had seemed destined to end in nothing but death and destruction. The cost of redemption, Elena learned as they emerged from the crypts into moonlight that seemed brighter than any illumination she had ever experienced, was that Lucian must now live forever with the full emotional weight of his immortal existence pressing upon a heart that had learned to feel again after centuries of protective numbness. Every day would bring new challenges as he struggled to balance his supernatural nature with his reclaimed humanity. Every night would carry the memory of those he had lost and those he had wronged. Every moment would test his resolve to honor Isabella and Arya's memory by becoming the protector he had been meant to be, rather than the destroyer he had chosen to become. But as Elena looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw them bright with tears that sparkled like stars in the darkness, she knew that this burden was also a gift, that feeling pain meant feeling love, that accepting guilt meant accepting responsibility for making amends, that choosing to live with the consequences of his actions meant choosing to believe that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen furthest from grace. The Vampire King had reclaimed his humanity, but more than that, he had reclaimed his hope. And Elena understood that together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead with hearts that had learned to beat in rhythm with something larger than their own fears and desires, something that might yet transform a kingdom built on darkness into a realm where light and shadow could coexist in the kind of balance that made both stronger than either could be alone. Elena discovered the hidden clause buried deep within the pages of the ancient law as dawn light crept through the windows of Isabella's preserved chamber, her fingers tracing words written in languages that predated the formation of kingdoms and spoke of magic so old it remembered when the world was young and the boundaries between life and death were more suggestions than absolute laws. The Lex Compassionis contained within its binding provisions a final sacrifice that the scholars had hidden even from those who invoked the law, a cruel mercy that offered complete healing for the vampire's tortured soul at the cost of the anchor's mortal existence, allowing the transfer of an entire human lifespan to burn away the accumulated guilt and grief that kept immortal hearts frozen in eternal winter. Elena read the elegant script with growing understanding and terrible clarity, realizing that she held in her hands the power to give Lucian something she had never dared hope was possible. True peace, the ability to remember Isabella and Arya with pure love, instead of the guilt that had poisoned every precious memory for 2 centuries, the chance to face eternity with a heart free from the crushing weight of self-recrimination that had transformed protector into destroyer and love into vengeance. The ritual was complex, but not impossible, requiring nothing more than willing sacrifice and the kind of love that placed another's healing above one's own survival. And Elena felt something settle in her chest like a key finding its proper lock, as she understood that this was why fate had brought her to the castle tower on that storm-torn night when she found the Vampire King weeping tears of blood over losses that had defined his existence for longer than most civilizations had endured. She began the preparations as morning light grew stronger beyond the windows that had witnessed Isabella's last days, gathering the materials, the ancient text described with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Candles arranged in patterns that spoke of sacred geometry, herbs that had grown in moonlight and been harvested by those who understood the delicate balance between life and death. Silver threads spun from moonbeams and woven with intentions pure enough to channel the kind of magic that could reshape the very foundations of an immortal soul. All of these Elena assembled with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual that had been old when the pyramids were young and would remain powerful long after the stars themselves had burned to ash. The words of the incantation flowed from her lips in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood, syllables that carried within them the weight of cosmic forces and the promise of transformation purchased with the ultimate currency of mortal existence, and she felt the air around her begin to shimmer with energies that made her skin tingle and her heart race with anticipation and terror in equal measure. The magical bond that connected her fate to Lucian's began to pulse with new purpose, invisible threads of power weaving themselves into patterns that would channel her life force directly into the wounded places of his immortal heart and burn away the darkness that had accumulated there like soot in a chimney that had never been properly cleaned. Elena had completed more than half the ritual before Lucian's supernatural senses alerted him to the magic being worked in Isabella's chamber, his immortal awareness suddenly blazing with alarm as he felt their bond transforming from simple connection into something that pulled at the very essence of her mortal existence. She heard his footsteps racing through the castle corridors with inhuman speed, heard doors slamming open as he followed the magical trail that led inevitably to the room where his beloved's memory lived on in preserved furnishings and faded perfume. But by the time he burst through the doorway with his storm-gray eyes wide with panic and understanding, Elena had already passed the point of no return. The ancient magic flowed through her like liquid starlight, carrying with it her memories and dreams and the bright flame of her mortal soul, transferring everything that made her who she was into the hollow spaces where Lucian's capacity for joy and hope had once resided before guilt carved them away piece by agonizing piece. She felt her life force streaming from her body in waves that left her increasingly weak and translucent, but also experienced a strange euphoria as she sensed his immortal heart beginning to heal, felt the weight of centuries lifting from his shoulders as her sacrifice burned away the poison that had kept him trapped in an endless cycle of rage and self-recrimination. Through the magical connection that bound them more intimately than any physical touch could achieve, Elena experienced the full breadth of Lucian's memories as her life force merged with his immortal essence. Seeing through his eyes, the man he had been before transformation changed him from protector to predator. She witnessed his mortal life in glimpses that took her breath away with their beauty and simplicity. A young lord who used his wealth and position to shelter orphans and protect travelers from bandits, who had chosen immortality not for power, but to better serve those who needed his protection, only to discover that the curse came with prices he had never imagined and hungers that threatened to consume everything he held dear. Elena saw his first meeting with Isabella, felt the wonder and terror that had warred in his chest as he realized that despite his supernatural nature, he was still capable of the most human of emotions, still able to love with a purity that made his immortal existence bearable rather than merely endurable. Through the transfer of her life force, Elena experienced the joy he had felt when Arya was born, the miracle of holding new life in arms that had dealt death for centuries, the transformation that occurred when a monster discovered he could create rather than merely destroy, could nurture instead of consuming, could love with a tenderness that made his supernatural strength irrelevant compared to the gentle way he touched his daughter's cheek or sang lullabies in languages older than recorded history. As Elena's mortal essence continued to flow into Lucian's immortal heart, healing wounds that had festered for 2 centuries, she also felt his growing love for her, the slow awakening of emotions he had thought dead forever as she brought light into chambers that had known only darkness, warmth into spaces that had been frozen by grief too profound for any mortal mind to comprehend fully. She experienced his wonder at her courage in staying when every instinct should have told her to run, his amazement at the way she saw past his monstrous reputation to the wounded soul that lay beneath, his gratitude for her simple acts of kindness that had reminded him why mortal life was precious and worth protecting rather than destroying in fits of misdirected rage. Elena felt his love for her growing stronger with each passing moment of their brief time together. Recognized the way it differed from his love for Isabella, not in intensity, but in character, carrying within it the wisdom of someone who had learned through loss how fragile happiness could be, and how important it was to cherish each moment of connection as the gift it truly was. The realization that she had become precious to someone who had seemed incapable of treasuring anything filled Elena with a warmth that made the growing cold of approaching death seem like a small price to pay for the miracle she was witnessing, the transformation of a heart from stone back into flesh, capable of bleeding and healing and loving again. But even as Elena felt her life slipping away like water through cupped hands, She sensed Lucian fighting against the ancient magic with a desperation that spoke of someone who had already lost too much and refused to accept another devastating blow to his slowly healing heart. His vampiric powers, enhanced by the very humanity she had helped him reclaim, reached out through their magical bond with tendrils of will strong enough to reshape reality itself, seeking to reverse the flow of life force that was transferring her mortality to heal his immortal wounds. Elena felt him grasping at the magical threads that connected them, using every ounce of supernatural strength he possessed to halt a process that had already progressed beyond the point where most would consider intervention possible, and she realized with a mixture of joy and terror that his newly restored capacity for love was giving him power. Even the ancient magic hadn't anticipated when it was first written by scholars who understood sacrifice, but perhaps not the kind of love that would refuse to accept such sacrifice even when freely given. The battle between Elena's willing gift and Lucian's desperate intervention played out in dimensions beyond the physical world, a war between competing magics that sent shockwaves through the fabric of reality itself and caused the very stones of the castle to tremble as if the earth itself was responding to forces being unleashed in Isabella's chamber. Lucian's voice reached Elena through the magical storm that surrounded them both, carrying words of love and desperate pleading as he fought to save her life, even though doing so would mean accepting the eternal burden of his restored humanity without the peace that complete healing would have provided. She heard him making his own impossible choice, using his vampiric powers not to take life as they had been designed to do, but to preserve it, channeling centuries of accumulated supernatural energy into stopping the transfer ritual at the exact moment when she had given enough of herself to restore his capacity for love, but not so much that her own mortal existence would be forfeit to the ancient magic that demanded such terrible prices for its gifts. The effort required was enormous, like trying to hold back a flooding river with nothing but will and determination. But Elena felt the flow of her life force gradually slowing and then stopping entirely, as Lucian's love proved strong enough to rewrite the terms of an ancient law that had seemed absolute and unchangeable. She remained conscious long enough to feel his arms gathering her weakened form against his chest, to hear him whispering promises that he would carry the weight of his grief and guilt forever if necessary, rather than lose another person he loved, to understand that his choice meant accepting a burden that would have crushed lesser souls, but that he would bear willingly for the chance to love again. The magical bond that connected them settled into a new configuration, as the interrupted ritual left them changed, but not destroyed. Elena's mortal essence forever intertwined with Lucian's immortal nature in ways that would slow her aging and extend her natural lifespan far beyond what any human could normally expect to enjoy. She would have decades with him, rather than the brief mortal span that would have made their love a fleeting thing overshadowed by the inevitability of loss. Time enough to help him learn how to live with his restored humanity and the eternal weight of his grief, years in which they could build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy and loss. Elena understood that they would face challenges unlike anything experienced by purely mortal or purely immortal couples, navigating the complex territory between life and death where their unique bond had placed them. But she also knew that love had already proven itself capable of working miracles in the space between heartbeats, in the moment when one soul chose to reach out to another across impossible distances and impossible odds. Recovery came slowly for Elena, as her mortal form adjusted to the changes wrought by magic older than civilization and more complex than any spell contained in written grimoires. But she found strength in Lucian's presence at her bedside, where he maintained a vigil that spoke of someone who had learned never to take precious things for granted. His storm-gray eyes had been permanently changed by their ordeal, now holding flecks of warm brown that spoke of humanity restored and maintained despite the cost and emotional pain that would be his constant companion throughout eternity. And Elena marveled at how love had transformed his face from the cold beauty of carved marble into something vibrant and alive and capable of expressing the full range of mortal emotions. When she was finally strong enough to walk through the castle gardens, Lucian took her to a secluded spot where two marble headstones marked the graves of Isabella and Arya, their surfaces carved with roses and inscriptions in languages that spoke of love, transcending death and memory, becoming a foundation for future hope rather than past regret. Together they knelt in the rich earth and planted flowers that would bloom in cycles of death and rebirth, creating beauty that would honor the memory of those who had been lost, while celebrating the love that had somehow survived the worst that fate and human cruelty could devise. As Elena worked beside him in the garden, her hands dark with earth that would nourish new life, she listened to Lucian's whispered promises to Isabella and Arya that their deaths would not be in vain, that their memory would guide him toward protecting the innocent rather than destroying them, that the love they had shown him would be multiplied and shared with others who needed shelter from the storms that raged through mortal existence. His voice carried the weight of genuine commitment as he spoke of transforming his kingdom from a place of darkness and fear into a sanctuary where the vulnerable could find safety, where his immortal strength would serve as a shield for those who had no other protection, where the lessons learned through loss and redemption would be used to build something better than what had existed before. Elena felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she understood that her choice to stay when she should have run had not only saved the vampire king's humanity but had taught him that love, not rage, was the greatest strength any soul could possess, that forgiveness could heal wounds deeper than any blade could cut, that hope could flourish even in soil that had been salted with tears and watered with blood. The story reached its culmination as Elena and Lucian climbed the stairs to the castle tower, where she had first discovered him weeping tears of blood over losses that had defined his existence for 2 centuries, their hands intertwined in a gesture that spoke of partnership forged in the crucible of shared ordeal and mutual sacrifice. From the windows where stormlight had once revealed his monstrous grief, they now watched dawn break over lands that had known too much darkness and were ready to embrace the possibility of something brighter and more hopeful than what had come before. Lucian's tears, when they came, were clear as mountain streams and warm as summer rain, carrying gratitude for a love that had chosen to see light in the deepest darkness, for a woman who had proven that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in fighting monsters, but in refusing to believe that anyone was irredeemably monstrous. Elena rested her head against his shoulder as sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, understanding that their story would be remembered not as a tale of redemption earned through suffering, but as proof that love could work miracles when it found the courage to reach across impossible distances and touch hearts that seemed forever lost to hope. The maid who had stayed when she should have run had broken every heart with her choice, because she had proven that sometimes the greatest love required the greatest sacrifice, and sometimes, if the gods were merciful and love was strong enough, both souls could be saved to write new chapters in a story that had once seemed destined to end in nothing but darkness and despair.